journalist safety and freedom of expression. UNESCO has launched guidelines which look at protecting freedom of information and access to information. What's the goal of the guidelines and how will they work?
We are in 2023. For most of the people connected to the internet, and we still have half of the planet not connected, it's more or less 15-20 years that the internet is a real thing in their lives. If you imagine the beginning of the 20th century when we had cars being invented, 20 years later people were actually using cars. And suddenly we start having problems, right? Accidents and things like that. So it was necessary to establish some rules of the game so that the car industry and people could use an important technology but feel safer about that. So we need safety belts, we need airbags, we need traffic lights and things like that. Of course, the internet's much more complex than the car industry, but it's a similar story. After 15-20 years, we have amazing developments, like the car industries. Good people can get faster and spending less energy from point A to point B, but they need to do that protecting their own lives. In the case of internet, it's fantastic that we have increased so much the voices present in the digital space, speaking about important issues to their personal lives, to their public lives, etc. But this system also came with some challenges. Among some of them, today we hear these words: disinformation, hate speech, conspiracy theories. So the challenge of these guidelines is mainly how we keep protecting this revolution for human rights, this positive revolution of having more voices being heard. Or even for other purposes. People do business in the internet, they find their boyfriends or girlfriends, doesn't matter, the good things, how we protect them. But at the same time, as we did with the car industry 1 century ago, how we protect these values, how we protect these rights. And for that, UNESCO is proposing these guidelines. If you will, it's like a manual of instructions on how we make this environment safe and we make this environment protective of freedom of expression, and every single player has a part to play in this process. And these guidelines is about that, is dialoguing with all these players.
UNESCO has also made it pretty clear that the guidelines need to be applied urgently because democracy itself is on the line due to disinformation and hate speech. Is it really that bad? The way that I see it, most people are aware they need to distance themselves from what they read on social media platforms, that they really can't take it at face value. Do you think it's going to impact the votes in the many elections that are being held in 2024?
An election, to stay with this example, although the impacts of disinformation and misinformation for democracy, they go beyond elections, but elections is basically a marketplace of ideas where candidates are explaining to the population how they are going to run a country or a city or a state. And people need to select based on their own preferences, which are legitimate. But when this marketplace of ideas, this ecosystem of exchanging proposals from candidates, citizens exposing what they want from the candidates, but also the watchdogs, the journalists, may be saying that this candidate was accused of corruption in a particular situation. When this ecosystem of exchange during an election is flooded with disinformation and misinformation and conspiracy theories, even if you yourself try to distance, you can't be completely isolated from that system. And this can generate problems because the purpose of protecting free and fair elections is that those two words, to be free and to be fair, means that the individual rights of the voters, including the right to seek and receive information, those rights are protected. If we don't have that, we don't have freedom and we don't have fairness.
And one of the other concerns of UNESCO is that content moderation, there's not enough of it, and it's only really being carried out in English, and all other languages around the world don't benefit from the services of human content moderators. Can you just talk to me about the challenge of addressing that?
It's fair to say that the companies have evolved for better in these last years, but just a couple of years ago, one of the whistleblowers of these companies who was revealing internal documents, we learned from this whistleblower that one particular social media company, on their entire budget for content moderation, 87% of that budget was for moderation in English language, which means that the other 7,000 languages registered by UNESCO Atlas of Language were getting 13% of this budget. This has improved in the last years, but unfortunately we are not quite yet there, because when we are talking about these concepts, the concepts we already mentioned during this interview, disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, etc., those things, although we can understand hate speech is a concept that people can identify when you speak about it, but the actual hate speech in this language, in this context, is very different to the hate speech in another language and in another context. Actually, some expressions that mean hate to a particular population or to a particular ethnic or religious group does not mean anything to another group. And so you don't need to regulate that particular speech. So the context, the language, they are essential to protect this right to seek and receive and the right to freedom of expression. Therefore, if the content moderation, it's not only adjusted by language, but is adjusted by context, if the human moderators involved in this process, they don't first speak the local language. Second, they don't understand the context. And third, as we heard in the Internet for Trust conference that we had here in UNESCO headquarters in February, from one of those human moderators who said in front of everyone how much he suffered from mental health issues because the companies were not protecting his and his colleagues' mental health in doing this very difficult job, because when you are moderating very strong images, very strong content, you need also to be yourself as an employer to have your rights protected in this case. So when you look to the UNESCO guidelines, you will see all these parameters very well established in terms of content moderation, which should be aligned with international human rights. So it's about linguistic diversity, it's about context diversity, but it's also about the protection of the rights of the content, the human content moderators. But if you allow me, of course, we need to be very clear that the human content moderation is not enough for dealing with this process, because the amount of information uploaded in the digital ecosystem every second is just impossible for the different interventions related to what you could call human moderators. Those, for instance, employed by the companies, but we also have, for instance, the fact checkers, which are very important development, human beings, journalists and others, looking into this content, for instance, during an election, and trying to help the citizens in saying what is reliable and accurate information, what's not. But when we are talking about billions of posts, if you also don't look into automated processes of moderation, and another story that we also tackle in the guidelines, the curation of this content, it's impossible to do it. And here again, these same issues are relevant. The automated processes also need to look into linguistic diversity, also need to be able to be trained, these algorithms, to understand the context-specific characteristics of what is happening, for instance, in the election A or B, or in a natural disaster C and D, where we also have lots of disinformation, or during a pandemic, or things like that. So what we are suggesting here, it's not guidelines to look into specific pieces of content. We are not interested for the particular post of Facebook or X that might have a hate speech, for instance. This particular content is something that a judge needs to decide through a due process of law, if it disrespect or not international law. What these guidelines are about processes. So we need to make sure that the entire ecosystem has better processes to, again, protect freedom of expression and access to information while dealing with some of the potential harms we just discussed.
So it's going to be a lengthy process to tackle all of these systems, but now we have a blueprint to follow in doing that. What I really took from the launch of the guidelines is that UNESCO is placing responsibility on many different shoulders. The guidelines are a document to be followed by governments, regulators, by civil society. They'll help civil society, but they're also very much addressed at the platforms themselves. Do we really believe that the platforms this time are going to step up and take responsibility and really adhere to the guidelines?
Look, I think the current signs overall, of course there are exceptions, is that even the platforms and their shareholders are showing they are concerned with the current scenario and the negative externalities that some of the logic through which these platforms operate can generate, again, for democracy, for elections, for a pandemic, and so on. And I guess that one concrete, let's say, proof of this concern is that all of them participated in this process that UNESCO developed through an entire year of consultations and so on. And there are different reasons for being a bit optimistic here. First is we are witnessing that countries all over the world are starting regulation on this area. And unfortunately, UNESCO data is showing that this regulation is not good. And when we say it's not good, what is the parameter? This regulation is not aligned with international human rights law. With good intentions or bad intentions, this new legislation that is being discussed or sometimes already approved, when you look into the parameters of international freedom of expression standards, unfortunately several of these bills, they don't pass the test. So this is not good for society, but it's not good for the platforms either. The other problem with this is that even if this regulation was more or less in line with the standards, if they are super fragmented and each decided to do a completely different story, imagine for any global company to deal with 194 different jurisdictions. So I imagine that for them, having a global player like UNESCO suggesting standards that can be applied across the border, of course respecting the different contexts and so on, is a good thing. Is a strong opportunity for reducing their own transactional costs, the costs of their operations in having their company's product in the country A, B, or C. So in that sense, we do think that they have all the incentives to embrace this idea that we need strong standards to protect freedom of expression, but also we need standards to deal with the current problems that the interaction of with this digital ecosystem is generating. Now, one important thing, we need to have from the outset at least one common understanding. Protecting human rights is not cheap. We need to invest money to do that. So if the platforms, and I don't think so, but if they think that these will come just as another story, it's not, because you need to readapt your systems. As we discussed during this interview, you need to invest money to have content moderation and curation in several languages. You need to protect your own employees. So all those things, they cost money. But you can think about costs, which is also important, but for the entire society, we also need to think this as an investment. Because imagine the costs, the real costs for democracies of the problems these things can generate, or the real costs for the public health system, mental health, but also during the pandemic. If people, because they don't have accurate information, they decide not to vaccine themselves, you have an actual cost for the public health system. So we need to think that these eventual costs that the companies, the governments, because they need to put in place new regulatory models, etc., they will need to put some budget aside, but the benefits for the entire public system, they are absolutely much bigger than the eventual cost they will have here.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that answer. And finally, I'd like you to offer our followers some advice on how they can really stay safe when they're on social media. How can they recognize disinformation? How can they really protect themselves from hate speech and ensure that they're not influenced by toxic debate, and that they can just enjoy social media really for fun?
Look, I think we need to, the first thing is to come back to some basics, right? Think about your own life, either if you are a child, a teenager, an adult. When you are taking the most important decisions in your life, you think a lot. You consult others. You're going to get married. After first moment of passion, you start asking, well, how this person is, maybe, well, how was the past? You ask former boyfriends or girlfriend. And with important information in the social media that can impact your life, you should do the same. The huge problem here, or the first and important problem here, is that people, they just forward things without at least trying to see at least two or two extra sources to see if that thing is actually true. No?
Yeah. We've all done it at least once.
And I'm the first one to raise my hand because it's so fast and so easy. But if we start thinking that we don't do that with other important things, right? If we are going to on vacations, we plan. We try to see, well, what other people are saying about this hotel or this Airbnb. We see 5 different reviews, or if we are going to the theater, or what people are saying, not just one critics, maybe 2 or 3 to compare. So we need to do the same. I know it takes time. Maybe it's easier if we just forward, but this is actually generating problems for the entire society, but also for the person that is not paying attention on that. But we also need to be absolutely clear. This is not only a responsibility of individuals. We can't put all the weight of solving this problem on the shoulders of the society, while we have $1 trillion companies that benefit from that, while we have governments that should take the primary responsibility to protect the human rights of every citizen, particularly freedom of expression, access to information. But yes, that said, each one of us can also play our role in this process, including interacting. I mean, there are unfortunately available research saying that one of the biggest spreaders of disinformation in a particular context is social media messaging services like WhatsApp or others of family. So we need to be brave in our family groups to say, look guys, maybe let's think if this is really true. Yeah. No? You don't need to enter in animosity with a family member that thinks differently from you. We need to stop attacking the messenger, even if the messenger is wrong, if it is your uncle, your son, or your aunt, or whatever. But you need to discuss the message. You need to be able to see, look, are you sure? Have you actually seen if this is a source that is related to the health system, or is just someone with an opinion about the vaccines, for instance? So I think this is actually a healthy exercise for all of us to think twice. I see with my own children, they were doing a few weeks ago a homework about fossil fuels, and they Google it very quickly, and the first sources that appeared were sources connected with oil companies, which it's legitimate that the oil companies say whatever they want to say. But I told to my kids, you can't use a source from an oil company because they have conflicts of interest with this issue. So you need to look for others, what others are saying about the same subject. So I think we need all to learn a healthier way of dealing with this brave new world, to quote Huxley about that. And if we all do that, it will be better, because we will try to engage with each other and with the content in a different way. We shouldn't be looking to patronize people. I think we need to empower people. Yeah. But to empower people, there is also structural changes that are necessary. For instance, and they are in the UNESCO guidelines, these companies, they should be more transparent in the way they deal with the content moderation and the content curation, so that people, citizens that are interacting with these platforms, they understand, for instance, that their news feed in Facebook or in Instagram or in Snapchat, I don't know, all the different technologies, they are not by chance. There is an algorithm that decides what you are receiving based on your own interests. But this is not something, this just appeared to me because it's like that. No. And okay, it's not a huge problem, but people need to understand that, and the companies should be mandatorily transparent about how this works, right?
I see exactly what you mean. I mean, we all need to place a much higher value on information, because it's a currency that's just been devalued in recent years a lot, hasn't it? And I see what you're saying about family debates. These are, it can be a little bit scary to wade in with your own family members. But if we learn how to just debate calmly, we're going to get a lot further.
But and also because, and it's true, it's natural, we are all human beings. But one thing that unfortunately is happening a lot, and it's part of this problem, is that this polarization is generating a situation that the conversation, again, is not about the subject matter. It's about your interlocutor. And when the conversation is about the interlocutor, the chances that this goes wrong they are very high, because then you are attacking the person who is sharing an information, even if it is wrong, right? But if you are concentrating in the information itself or in the disinformation, then maybe it's a different debate. You can even say, look, I respect different ways of thinking, but the earth is not flat. The earth, you can see the pictures. So we need to at least agree in some common facts. And then we can, if you all agree that the earth is not flat, I respect your opinion if you don't think that the earth seen from outer space is beautiful or not. You can think it's beautiful, she or he can think it's ugly. That's fair enough. But we all need to agree that's not flat.
Well, Guilherme, I really need to get that tone, that calm tone when I'm next talking to my uncle about Brexit. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me. Guilherme Canella.
A pleasure.
Thank you.